We all know that moment, don't we, when something goes sideways. And almost instinctively, we look for answers.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, often someone dependent on it seems like a really deeply ingrained part of how we operate.
It really does.
So today, we're going to take a close look at this human tendency. Maybe call it human blaming.
Exactly. And for this exploration, we've pulled together insights from quite a few different fields: psychology, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, even some biology.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, trying to really understand the roots and, the reach of this behavior. It's pretty widespread.
And what we're aiming for in this deep dive, really, is to unpack this whole complex subject in a way that's, well, fascinating, but also useful for you. The idea is, by understanding some surprising aspects of blame, you can maybe gain a richer perspective on your own reactions and the dynamics we see playing out all around us.
Hopefully offering some clarity without, drowning in information.
Exactly. So let's just dive right in. What exactly are we talking about when we say human blaming?
Okay. So at its core, based on what we've looked at, human blaming is really the act of assigning fault or responsibility maybe for bad events or outcomes to specific people or groups.
Right.
Psychologically, this lines up with, attributing responsibility for something wrong. And sociologically, it kind of reflects that tendency to hold individuals accountable for their situation.
And it's not usually neutral, is it? This assigning of blame?
No, not typically. It often carries a real weight of negative emotion, like resentment or anger. It's not just a cold assessment.
Okay. And this isn't just something modern or, specific to certain personalities.
Not at all. Our research consistently shows this cuts across everything: gender, age, culture, different historical periods. It really seems to be fundamental.
Wow.
Yeah, a basic part of how humans interact socially.
Okay, so it's universal. But let's dig into the why. Psychologically, what's actually going on in our minds when we, start pointing the finger?
Well, from a psychological view, blame is deeply tangled up with our thinking patterns. And our emotions, too. Cognitively, it can show up as what psychologists call a distortion, basically a way our minds can kind of misinterpret things, often leading us to pin our feelings on outside sources instead of looking inward.
Oh, okay.
And emotionally, it's often fueled by negative feelings, things like anger, guilt, shame. Blame can then sort of act as a defense mechanism.
A defense.
Yeah, a way to shield ourselves from maybe personal accountability, to manage those uncomfortable feelings.
So it's a form of self-protection almost.
Precisely. A really key mechanism here is something called projection.
Projection.
Yeah. Imagine you're feeling, say, insecure about something. But instead of acknowledging that feeling, you start criticizing other people for being insecure.
Ah, I see.
That's projection.
Yeah.
You're attributing your own maybe unacceptable feelings or flaws onto others, especially when admitting our own mistakes feels just too difficult.
Right.
So in that sense, blame can be a really quick escape from the discomfort of guilt, almost automatic when we feel pressure. Our sources even suggest this is linked to a deep-seated, often pretty unrealistic desire for perfection. We avoid seeing our own flaws by shifting the responsibility.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's often easier to say it's their fault than to confront our own imperfections, isn't it?
Exactly. And this outward shift, that's also sometimes called blame avoidance. Yeah. And then there's deflection, too. That's where we attribute our problems to external factors or other people, kind of to protect our self-esteem.
So you make yourself the victim of circumstance.
Kind of, yeah, instead of accepting any personal role. For instance, someone might blame a coworker for a project failure to avoid admitting, maybe, they didn't manage their own time well.
But this kind of thinking, it doesn't really lead to positive outcomes in the long run, does it?
No, not really. I mean, it might offer a temporary sense of relief, sure, but ultimately it really hinders personal growth.
Okay.
Well, by not recognizing our own part in situations, we miss chances to learn and change. And over time, this pattern of blaming can really take a toll on our mental well-being. It could potentially contribute to things like anxiety, depression, even addictive behaviors. And we should also mention self-blame.
Ah, right. Blaming yourself.
Yeah, which, even though it's directed inward, can be just as damaging. It can lead to low self-esteem, feelings of helplessness. And the thing is, the more we engage in blaming, whether it's others or ourselves, the more ingrained this behavior gets. It actually strengthens those neural pathways in our brain.
Wow, that's a powerful image, like a mental habit that just gets harder and harder to shake.
Exactly.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. Blame isn't just an individual psychological thing, right? It plays a pretty big role in how our societies function, too.
Absolutely. Sociologically, blame serves several functions. We often categorize it as either individual blame,
Okay.
where we hold people mainly responsible for their own situations and outcomes, or system blame,
System blame.
which focuses more on the broader social, economic, or political factors that contribute to those situations.
Right, so blaming the person versus blaming, like, the environment or the rules.
Precisely. And blame can act as a mechanism for social control. It helps reinforce norms, expectations within a group, by imposing sanctions on those who step out of line.
Okay.
And when blame becomes like the main way of interacting within a group or society, it can lead to what some call a culture of blame.
A culture of blame.
Yeah, where the emphasis is really more on finding fault than on, say, finding solutions or understanding the underlying causes.
And this culture of blame, I imagine it looks different depending on the specific social structure.
Exactly. Think about market dynamics, for instance. Blame can become a tactic in power struggles between companies, individuals.
Yeah.
In big bureaucracies, blame often tends to flow downwards. It gets pinned on those lower in the hierarchy, maybe for not following rules precisely.
The classic passing the buck.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
And in really close-knit groups, blame might get directed towards outsiders. That can strengthen the internal bonds, create that us versus them feeling. Or it can even involve accusations within the group betrayal, maybe to maintain cohesion. And we've probably all seen the kick the dog effect in hierarchies.
Where someone gets blamed by their boss, so they blame their subordinate.
Exactly. Someone higher up blames them, so they redirect it downwards. And authorities, too, can strategically use blame to maintain control, deflect responsibility.
It definitely sounds like blame can be a tool for maintaining existing power structures, whether it's fair or not.
It certainly can be used that way.
Now, what about how different cultures around the world approach blame? Are there big variations?
Well, yeah. Cultural norms have a strong influence on how we perceive blame, attribute it, express it.
Like how?
Well, research shows interesting differences between, say, individualistic cultures, think U.S., Western Europe maybe, which tend to emphasize personal responsibility, independence, and collectivistic cultures often found in East Asia, Latin America, which prioritize group harmony, interdependence.
So how does that affect blame?
Well, in collectivistic cultures, behaviors that disrupt group harmony might be seen as more serious. So there might be a greater emphasis on social control, maybe more direct forms of blame. Individualistic cultures, on the other hand, might put a higher value on individual liberties, so they might have different thresholds for what actually warrants blame.
Interesting.
And even something like an apology can mean different things.
Really?
Yeah. In the U.S., an apology often implies admitting fault, right? I'm sorry I did X.
Usually, yeah.
Whereas in Japan, for example, an apology might be more about acknowledging that social harmony was disrupted, expressing regret for that disruption, but not necessarily admitting personal wrongdoing in the same way we might think of it.
Huh. That's a subtle but important difference.
It is. And beyond that, deeply ingrained cultural beliefs and stereotypes can absolutely lead to unfair, biased blame towards certain groups or individuals.
So, our cultural background profoundly shapes how we even understand and use blame. Okay, let's take a step back in time. Where did this tendency towards human blaming even come from? What do history and anthropology tell us?
Well, anthropological research suggests that in early human societies, when people faced unexplained or negative events like a drought or sickness, attributing blame often served as a way to create some kind of understanding and maybe a sense of control.
Control over chaos.
Kind of. Mary Douglas, an influential anthropologist, she talked about moralizing misfortune in some societies.
Moralizing misfortune.
Yeah, the idea that bad things happening were often blamed on individuals breaking taboos or committing sins. This actually helped reinforce the community's beliefs and values.
Right. Keeps everyone in line.
In a way. And there's the classic study by Evans Pritchard of the Azande people in Africa. He showed how their beliefs in witchcraft acted as a system for redirecting blame when misfortune struck. It helped manage social conflicts within the community.
So blame helped early humans make sense of a world they didn't fully understand.
Pretty much. And as societies evolved, with agriculture, wealth accumulation, social hierarchies emerging, the patterns and targets of blame likely shifted too. Your thought earlier about blame maybe originating as a way to alleviate pain, prolong life, by providing that sense of control in a chaotic world, that's a really compelling idea.
Well, it seems plausible, maybe.
It does. Attributing bad events to specific actions, even if incorrectly, might have offered a psychological sense of agency. If we don't do X, then Y won't happen.
Right.
And then later changes like social stratification, like,
Right.
Rich and poor, powerful and less powerful, that probably contributed to patterns of blaming those with less power for their circumstances.
Which brings us neatly to the ethical side of things.
Yeah.
When is it actually ethically okay, if ever, to assign blame? That feels like a minefield.
It's a hugely important question, and yeah, ethically very complex. Philosophically, the whole debate about free will versus determinism is central here.
Right. If we don't have free will, can we be blamed?
Exactly. If our actions are all predetermined, can we truly be held morally responsible and therefore legitimately blamed? Different philosophies have different takes.
Like what?
Well, you've got libertarianism, which emphasizes free will and individual agency, suggesting we are responsible for our choices.
Okay.
Then there's hard determinism, arguing everything is causally determined, which could potentially undermine moral responsibility and blame altogether.
Right.
And compatibilism tries to find a middle ground, suggesting free will and determinism might coexist somehow.
Complicated stuff.
Very. Ethically, many frameworks suggest we should ideally consider things like intent and causality when judging blame. Did they mean to do it? Did their action actually cause the harm?
Makes sense.
Where it becomes ethically really problematic is when individuals are blamed for systemic issues, things far bigger than them, or for circumstances largely beyond their control.
Like blaming someone for being poor without considering economic structures?
Exactly. And victim blaming is a particularly troubling ethical issue, holding people responsible for harm that happened to them, that often totally ignores power imbalances and underlying injustices.
Yeah.
So your question about the ethical boundaries really hits the nail on the head. When does assigning blame cross that line from maybe fair accountability into something harmful or unfair?
It really underscores how tricky it is to judge intent, which seems so central to how we blame people.
It absolutely is.
Okay, now let's turn to biology. Is there any evidence that our brains are somehow wired in a way that makes us prone to blaming?
Yes, actually. There's some fascinating and growing research in neuroscience looking at the neural underpinnings of blame.
Like brain scans and things.
Exactly. Studies using brain imaging have identified specific brain regions that light up when we're evaluating blame. One key area is called the temporoparietal junction, or TPJ.
TPJ.
Yeah, it plays a crucial role in our ability to understand the intentions and mental states of others. Theory of mind, basically. And that's critical for deciding blame, right? Was it intentional?
Another area involved is the amygdala. That's linked to processing emotions, especially negative ones. And it tends to show more activity when we're assigning blame.
So emotion and understanding intentions are key brain processes.
Seems like it. And from an evolutionary angle, this tendency to blame could be seen as a kind of social regulatory mechanism. It might have roots in the social behaviors of other mammals even.
Really?
Potentially, yeah. It might have helped in developing social norms, cooperation, keeping groups together in early human communities. And interestingly, research on implicit bias, those automatic, often unconscious judgments we make, reveals that the amygdala's rapid responses to perceived differences can actually contribute to unintentional or unfair blame. We might react negatively before we even consciously process things.
Wow. What about genetics? Is there any evidence suggesting our tendency to blame might be, partly inherited?
That's a really complex area, and the research is ongoing and, frankly, quite nuanced.
Studies looking at how genetic explanations affect our judgments of moral responsibility have given kind of inconsistent results.
How so?
Well, in some cases, if a condition like obesity or maybe certain mental illnesses are attributed to genetic factors, people might see the individual as less blameworthy. It's genetic, they can't control it.
Right.
But sometimes those same genetic explanations can unfortunately lead to more negative attitudes or stigma. It's in their genes, they'll never change.
The double-edged sword.
Exactly. And it's also been found that our existing beliefs, even our political leanings, can influence how readily we accept genetic explanations for various human traits.
So it's not straightforward.
Not at all. So while there might be some basic inherited capacity for moral judgment and social evaluation, the specific ways we assign blame are almost certainly heavily shaped by our experiences, our culture, what we learn.
It's really remarkable how all these different angles, psychological, societal, cultural, historical, ethical, biological, are so interconnected when it comes to something we do so often, sometimes without even thinking.
It really is a tangled web.
So where do we typically see human blaming playing out in our everyday lives? Can you give us some, like, common examples?
Oh, absolutely. It's pervasive. In our personal relationships, right? Partners blaming each other for arguments, unhappiness,
Sure. Yeah.
in work environments. When projects fail or deadlines get missed, there's often that scramble to figure out who's at fault.
Definitely seen that.
And on a bigger societal scale, think about debates on issues like poverty or crime. They often boil down to arguments about whether individuals are to blame for their circumstances or if it's more about systemic factors.
The individual versus system blame again.
Exactly. And emotionally, our responses to blame can be all over the place. As the blamer, you might feel anger, maybe satisfaction, even a sense of righteousness as the one being blamed. Reactions can range from defensiveness and anger to shame, sadness.
Yeah.
And it's worth remembering the role of intentionality again. We tend to judge actions we think were intentional much more harshly.
Right.
And your concern earlier about blame affecting whether we help people, that's very valid. When we blame someone for their difficulties, it can unfortunately reduce our empathy, make us less willing to offer support.
That's sad.
It is. And in the most tragic cases, blame can even be weaponized, used to justify cruelty, violence. Perpetrators might dehumanize and blame their victims.
That really highlights a darker side of blame.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, is it actually a necessary part of how we interact? Do we need it?
That's a really profound question. I mean, while harsh, unproductive blaming can clearly be incredibly damaging,
Yeah.
you could argue that the underlying capacity to evaluate actions, hold people accountable when it's appropriate, learn from mistakes, that might be necessary for social order, for cooperation.
So accountability versus blame.
Perhaps. The key really seems to lie in discerning the difference between constructive accountability, which might be needed, and destructive blame, which is often harmful.
Okay, so given all these potential negative consequences, what practical steps can we take? How can we reduce harmful human blaming in our own lives and maybe in society?
Our sources point to several promising paths. On a broader scale, maybe advanced AI tools could eventually help analyze blame patterns in different situations.
AI. How?
Well, maybe by identifying patterns, they could help design educational programs or even simulations to promote more constructive ways of dealing with conflict. It's speculative, but possible.
Interesting. What about on an individual level? Things we can do?
Definitely. Cultivating empathy is huge. Actively trying to understand different perspectives, putting yourself in someone else's shoes,
Right.
embracing the idea of responsibility without blame. That means taking ownership of our actions and their consequences, but without beating ourselves up or pointing fingers at others.
Okay, taking responsibility, not assigning fault.
Exactly. The principles of restorative justice also offer a valuable framework. They focus on repairing harm, fostering reconciliation, rather than just assigning blame and punishment.
That sounds different.
It is. And then there's developing greater self-awareness, particularly around our own emotional responses. Learning techniques for emotional regulation can help us manage negative feelings without automatically resorting to blame.
So managing our own reactions better.
Yes. And finally, actively challenging our own cognitive distortions, those unhelpful thinking patterns that often fuel blame, questioning our assumptions.
Right. And what about that aspiration maybe someone listening has to just feel good all the time? Does reducing blame help with that?
Well, it's important to recognize that experiencing a full range of emotions, including negative ones, is actually a natural and healthy part of being human. The goal isn't really to eliminate negative feelings entirely.
Okay.
It's more about enhancing our overall well-being, building resilience so we can handle challenges, and developing healthy, constructive ways of coping that don't rely on blame. Reducing unproductive blame definitely contributes to that overall well-being.
Some really valuable insights there. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into human blaming, it's clearly incredibly complex, multifaceted.
Definitely.
It's deeply tied into our psychology, shaped by our societies, our cultures, has historical roots, raises big ethical questions, has biological links in our brains, and it shows up everywhere in our daily lives.
It really touches on almost every aspect of human experience.
And while that initial impulse to assign blame might feel almost automatic, almost natural, it's also clear that unproductive blame can have really damaging effects.
Absolutely. And perhaps the most, well, empowering takeaway is this. While that tendency to look for someone to blame might be deeply ingrained, maybe even partly innate, we do have the capacity to consciously choose differently.
Choose what instead?
Choose understanding, choose accountability, choose resolution over unproductive blame. And making that choice, even just a bit more often, can lead to a more positive, more compassionate, and ultimately, I think, a more fulfilling human experience for ourselves and for everyone around us.
A powerful and definitely thought-provoking conclusion. It certainly gives all of us something to reflect on our own blaming habits and the alternatives we've talked about today. Thanks so much for taking this deep dive with me.
My pleasure. It was fascinating to explore.
This is DigitView.